The air in the penthouse office was thick, charged with the kind of tension that makes your skin prickle. Julian Vane didn't move, but his presence filled the room like a physical weight. He leaned in, his breath grazing the shell of Alara's ear, the scent of expensive sandalwood and cold ambition swirling around her. For a second, the world outside, the flashing lights of the city, the chaos of her life, simply ceased to exist. He was a man who owned everything, and in that moment it felt like he was deciding if he wanted to own her too. But Alara wasn't a prize to be bought, and the fire in her eyes told him exactly that. If he wanted a match, he'd finally found one that could burn his entire world down. Before we dive into how this explosive encounter changed everything, make sure you hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves a high-stakes romance, and subscribe with notifications turned on. You're not going to want to miss a single chapter of this 30-part journey. Julian Vane was a man who lived his life by the numbers. As the heir to the Vane tech empire, his world was composed of stock tickers, acquisition reports, and the cold, hard logic of the bottom line. He was 28, devastatingly handsome in a way that felt more like a warning than an invitation, and possessed a heart that many whispered was carved from the same silicon he used in his processors. But Julian had a problem that logic couldn't solve: the marriage clause. His grandfather, a man as ruthless as Julian but with a penchant for traditional legacies, had left a ticking time bomb in his will. Julian had until his 30th birthday to find a wife, a suitable match, or the controlling shares of Vane Tech would be liquidated and donated to a board of trustees he couldn't control. To Julian, love was a biological glitch. Marriage was a merger. He didn't need a soulmate, he needed a signature on a contract. That was why he'd hired the architect, the world's most exclusive, most secretive matchmaker. The architect didn't use feelings. They used a proprietary algorithm that analyzed genetic compatibility, intellectual parity, and psychological resilience. Julian wanted the perfect woman, someone who could handle the pressure of his world without the messy interference of actual emotion. "I found her," the architect's voice crackled over a secure line. "But she isn't in our database. She isn't a debutante, and she isn't the daughter of a CEO. She's a 22-year-old college student at the university." Julian had scoffed. A student. He envisioned someone naive, someone easily swayed by a black American Express card and a private jet. He was wrong. While Julian was presiding over boardrooms, Alara Vance was presiding over a laboratory bench. At 22, Alara's life was a masterclass in survival. She was a senior biochemistry major, a woman who found more beauty in the structure of a complex protein than in the sparkle of a diamond. But her brilliance was overshadowed by a crushing reality. Her father was sick. The medical bills were piling up faster than she could work her 2 part-time jobs, and her dream of medical school was slipping through her fingers. She was exhausted, overworked, and fiercely independent. When the black SUV pulled up to the curb outside her cramped apartment building, Alara assumed it was a debt collector or a mistake. When a man in a suit that cost more than her tuition stepped out and handed her a gold-embossed folder, she didn't feel lucky. She felt suspicious. "Mr. Julian Vane would like to discuss a proposal," the man said. Alara opened the folder. It wasn't an invitation to a date. It was a dossier on her own life. Her grades, her father's health records, her financial standing. Every secret she tried to hide was laid bare in high-resolution print. The proposal was simple: marry Julian Vane for 2 years, secure his inheritance, and in exchange, every cent of her father's debt would vanish, and her future would be paved in gold. She should have thrown the folder in his face. She should have walked away. But that night, as she sat in the hospital watching the rhythmic, expensive beep of her father's heart monitor, the marriage clause didn't look like a prison. It looked like a lifeline. The first time they met was in Julian's private office at the top of Vane Tower. He expected her to be intimidated. He expected her to be wide-eyed at the floor-to-ceiling glass and the sheer opulence of his life. Instead, Alara walked in, tossed the contract onto his mahogany desk, and sat down without being asked. Item 4, Section B, she said, her voice steady. The clause about public appearances. I have exams. I have lab hours. If you want me to play the part of the doting fiancé, you're going to have to schedule it around my organic chemistry finals. Julian looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. She wasn't wearing makeup. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and there was a faint stain of blue ink on her thumb. She was the most inconvenient person he had ever met, and yet the algorithm was never wrong. Looking into her defiant eyes, Julian felt a strange, unfamiliar spark of something that felt suspiciously like a challenge. "You're a student, Alara," Julian said, his voice a low velvet growl. "I'm offering you a world where you never have to worry about a final or a bill again. Why are you making this difficult?" "Because unlike you, Julian," she replied, leaning forward until they were inches apart, "I actually plan on earning my success. If I'm doing this, it's a business deal. Nothing more. Don't expect me to fall in love with the hero of a story I never asked to be in." Julian leaned back, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Love was never part of the contract. But as the elevator doors closed on their first meeting, both of them knew the same thing. The contract was just the beginning. Julian Vane had spent his life looking for a match he could control, but he had accidentally found the only woman capable of burning his carefully constructed world to the ground. The student was about to teach the billionaire a lesson he never saw coming. This is the start of a game where the stakes are higher than billions, and the heart is the ultimate prize. But tell me, if you were in Alara's shoes, facing a mountain of debt and a dying parent, would you sign a contract to marry a stranger for 2 years, even if he was the most arrogant man you ever met? The ink on the contract was barely dry before the reality of Alara's new life began to settle in like a heavy, velvet shroud. She didn't return to her cramped, one-bedroom apartment that night. Instead, a sleek black car waited for her at the hospital entrance. The driver, a silent man with a face like granite named Marcus, holding the door open with a level of deference that made her skin crawl. Julian Vane didn't do things by halves. If she was his fiancée, she was to be treated like royalty, even if the throne was a high-rise penthouse that felt more like a gilded cage than a home. Her first night in the Vane estate was spent in a room larger than her entire apartment. The sheets were silk, the air was climate-controlled to perfection, and the silence was deafening. There were no sounds of sirens outside, no noisy neighbors arguing through thin walls, just the hum of the city far below and the rhythmic ticking of a clock that seemed to be counting down the seconds of her freedom. She stared at the massive diamond on her finger, a rock so heavy it felt like a shackle, and wondered if she'd sold her soul or saved her life. The next morning, the business of being a billionaire's match began in earnest. Alara was woken up not by an alarm, but by a team of stylists and assistants who moved through her suite with the efficiency of a SWAT team. Julian had made it clear. Her university schedule was to be respected, but her image was now vain property. As they poked and prodded, draped her in fabrics she couldn't name and applied makeup that felt like a mask, Alara caught a glimpse of herself in the floor-to-ceiling mirror. She looked like a stranger, polished, expensive, and fragile. "Mr. Vane is waiting for you in the breakfast room," one of the assistants whispered, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the illusion. Julian was sitting at the head of a long, marble table, his attention focused entirely on a tablet. He didn't look up when she entered, but he didn't have to. The air shifted the moment she stepped into the room. He was dressed in a charcoal suit, looking every bit the shark who had just devoured a rival, but there was a tightness in his jaw that suggested he hadn't slept any better than she had. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the seat at his right. "The press will be outside the university today. We've leaked the engagement to a few select outlets. You need to look happy, Alara. Not like you're walking toward a firing squad." "It's hard to look happy when I'm being managed like a social media account, Julian," she snapped, pulling out the chair with a loud scrape. "And I told you, I have a lab today. I can't have the press hovering over my microscope while I'm trying to synthesize a compound." Julian finally looked up, his dark eyes tracing the transformation the stylist had achieved. For a fleeting second, his gaze softened, a flicker of genuine surprise at how well she wore the role, but it was gone before she could be sure it was there. "Marcus will handle the perimeter. You do your work, but the ring stays on, and when I pick you up at 5 for the Foundation Gala, you will be ready. No excuses." The contrast between her two worlds was never more jarring than when she arrived at the University of Lagos. Usually, Ilara was invisible, just another student in a lab coat, hunched over a centrifuge. But today, the atmosphere was electric. Whispers followed her down the hallways. People who had never looked her way were suddenly staring, their eyes darting to the massive stone on her left hand. In the lab, her best friend Chloe was waiting, her jaw practically on the floor. Chloe was the kind of person who lived for drama, her phone always glued to her hand, but even she seemed stunned into silence. "Ilara," Chloe hissed, grabbing her arm the second they were alone in the chemical storage room. "Tell me the news is lying. Tell me you aren't actually engaged to Julian Vane. The Julian Vane, the man who literally looks like he was drawn by a Renaissance artist and then given a heart of ice." "It's complicated, Chloe," Ilara whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Complicated? Girl, this is a fairy tale. Or a horror movie, I haven't decided yet," Chloe laughed, though her eyes were filled with concern. "People are saying you've been secretly dating for months. They're saying you're the mystery match the elites have been buzzing about. Is it true? Did he really sweep you off your feet?" Ilara looked at her friend, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. She wanted to tell Chloe everything about the debt, the contract, the cold man in the penthouse, but the non-disclosure agreement she'd signed was 50 pages long. "He's not what people think," she said finally, which was the only truth she could afford. The day was a blur of high-pressure titrations and higher-pressure questions. Every time Ilara stepped outside the lab, she could feel the camera lenses from the street. Marcus was always there, a silent shadow in the distance, ensuring no one got too close. It was a strange, suffocating kind of protection. By the time 5 o'clock rolled around, Ilara was exhausted. She changed into the gown the stylist had left for her, a deep, midnight blue silk that seemed to flow like water. When Julian's car pulled up to the university gates, the crowd of students and photographers went into a frenzy. Julian himself stepped out to open the door for her, a move designed for the cameras, his hand resting firmly on the small of her back as he guided her inside. The heat from his palm seeped through the silk of her dress, sending a jolt through her that she wasn't prepared for. He looked at her, his face a mask of calculated charm for the onlookers, but his voice was a low murmur only she could hear. "You did well today," he said as the car pulled away. "The stocks are already responding. People love a Cinderella story." "I'm not Cinderella, Julian," she replied, staring out the window at the blurred city lights. "Cinderella wanted to go to the ball. I just want to finish my degree." "The world doesn't care what you want, Ilara. They care about what you represent," he said coldly, turning back to his tablet. The Foundation Gala was a sea of old money and sharp knives. Every woman in the room looked at Ilara with a mixture of envy and suspicion, and every man looked at Julian with renewed respect. This was the debut. This was the moment the match became reality in the eyes of the elite. But as Julian led her onto the dance floor, his hand pulling her close, the performance began to feel dangerously real. The music was slow, a haunting melody that seemed to pull at the edges of her resolve. Julian moved with a predatory grace, his eyes locked onto hers, searching for a weakness. "You're shaking," he noted, his voice vibrating against her temple. "I don't like being watched," she admitted, her breath hitching. "Then look at me," he commanded. "Ignore them, just look at me." And she did. For a moment, the room disappeared. The diamonds, the cameras, the contracts, it all faded into the background. There was only the scent of him, the strength of his arms, and the terrifying realization that the algorithm might have been right about more than just her DNA. But the bubble was burst by a sharp, feminine voice that cut through the music like glass. "Julian, darling, I see you finally brought your little project out into the light." They stopped mid-turn. Standing there, draped in silver and looking like a goddess of war, was Serafina, Julian's ex, the woman the world thought he would marry. Her eyes raked over Alara with a disdain so pure it was almost physical. "She's charming," Serafina said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "In a very collegiate sort of way. I assume the wedding will be a small affair. Or is this just a temporary arrangement to keep the board happy?" Julian's grip on Alara's waist tightened, his knuckles turning white. The air between the three of them turned frigid, the fake romance suddenly hitting its first real obstacle. Alara felt the eyes of the entire ballroom on them, waiting for her to crumble. But Alara Vance didn't crumble. She stepped forward, her chin lifted, the fire that had survived years of lab work and poverty flashing in her eyes. "It's funny you should ask about temporary arrangements, Serafina," Alara said, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by the surrounding guests. "Because from what I've heard, you're the world's leading expert on them." The silence that followed was absolute. Julian looked down at Alara, a look of genuine, unscripted shock crossing his face, followed quickly by something that looked remarkably like a grin. He didn't say a word. He simply leaned down, his lips brushing against Alara's forehead in a gesture of public claim that sent Serafina reeling back in fury. But as they walked away, Alara saw something in the corner of the room that made her heart stop. Standing near the exit, tucked away in the shadows, was a man she recognized. A man who shouldn't have been there. A man who knew exactly where her father's medical bills had been coming from before Julian Vane ever entered the picture. The game was changing. It wasn't just about a contract anymore. It was about a past that was catching up to them both, and a secret that could destroy the Vane empire before the first year of the marriage even began. Julian noticed her sudden paleness, his hand tightening on hers as he whispered, "What is it?" Before she could answer, the lights in the ballroom flickered and died, plunging the elite of the city into a terrifying, sudden darkness. In the chaos that followed, a single voice whispered into Alara's ear, a voice that didn't belong to Julian. "The debt isn't paid until I say it's paid, Alara." The darkness wasn't just an absence of light, it was a physical weight pressing the air out of Alara's lungs. The voice, cold, familiar, and dripping with a malice that the algorithm could never have predicted, lingered in her ear like a ghost. Julian's hand was still clamped on her waist, his body shielding hers instinctively, but he hadn't heard the whisper. To him, this was a security breach, a mechanical failure. To Alara, it was the sound of her past coming to collect. "Marcus," Julian's voice barked through the gloom, authoritative and sharp. Within seconds, the emergency beams kicked in, dim, red-hued lights that cast long, demonic shadows across the ballroom. The elite of the city were in a state of controlled panic, the rustle of silk and the clatter of dropped champagne flutes creating a frantic percussion. Julian didn't wait for the main power to return. He swept Alara toward the service exit, his movements fluid and urgent. "What happened back there?" Julian asked once they were shielded by the tinted glass of the SUV, the doors locking with a heavy thud. He wasn't looking at the road, he was looking at her. His eyes were narrowed, scanning her face for the truth she was trying so hard to bury. "You went white before the lights even went out. Who did you see, Alara?" "Nobody," she lied, her voice trembling just enough to betray her. "It was just the pressure, the cameras, Serafina. It was a lot." Julian leaned in, his shadow falling over her. "Don't lie to me. We are partners in this contract and I don't pay for surprises. If there is a threat to you, it's a threat to the Vane image." Alara looked at him, this man who saw her as felt a surge of bitter irony. How could she tell him that before he had saved her with his millions, another man had been paying her father's hospital bills in secret? How could she explain that she thought she'd escaped a debt to a monster only to fall into a contract with a billionaire? "I'm tired, Julian," she said, turning her head toward the window. "I have a 6 a.m. lab. Can we just go?" Julian stared at her for a long beat, the silence in the car stretching until it felt like it might snap. Finally, he gave a curt nod to Marcus, and the car pulled away. But Julian didn't go back to his tablet. For the first time, he watched her, really watched her, not as a business asset, but as a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. The next morning, the University of Lagos felt different. The Cinderella story had gone viral overnight. Ilara's face was on every tabloid, captioned as the student who tamed the tech king. But as she walked toward the science complex, she felt less like royalty and more like prey. In the lab, the atmosphere was stifling. It wasn't just the students whispering, it was the faculty. Even her professor, a man who usually only cared about molecular weights, gave her a lingering, suspicious look. But the real shock came when she reached her station. Sitting on her lab bench next to her centrifuge was a single black envelope. No name, no return address. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside was a single Polaroid photo. It was a picture of her father in his hospital bed, taken from the doorway of his room. On the back, written in the same precise, chilling hand, "The veins buy companies, Ilara. I buy souls. Don't forget who owned yours first." "Ilara, you okay?" She jumped, nearly knocking over a rack of test tubes. It was Dr. Aris Thorne, a young, brilliant researcher who had recently joined the faculty. Aris was everything Julian wasn't: approachable, kind, and genuinely passionate about the science. He'd been a mentor to Ilara for the past few months, someone she actually respected. "I'm fine, Dr. Thorne," she said, quickly shoving the envelope into her bag. "Just a long night." "I saw the news," Aris said, leaning against the bench, his expression unreadable. Julian Vane is a powerful man, but power has a way of casting very long shadows, Ilara. If you ever feel like you're getting lost in them, remember that the lab is the one place where the truth doesn't care about your bank account. There was something in his tone, a weight, a warning that made Ilara pause. She looked at Aris, wondering if he knew more than he was letting on. But before she could probe further, her phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Penthouse 7 p.m. We have a guest. Wear the black dress. JV." The guest turned out to be the one person Julian feared more than a stock market crash: his sister, Helena Vane. Helena was 34, a sharp-featured woman with hair like spun glass and a reputation for being the true enforcer of the Vane family legacy. She didn't believe in algorithms, and she certainly didn't believe in her brother's sudden engagement to a middle-class student. When Ilara walked into the dining room, Helena didn't stand. She simply sipped her wine and watched Ilara with the cold, calculating eyes of a bird of prey. Julian stood by the fireplace, looking uncharacteristically tense. "So," Helena began, her voice a sharp contrast to Julian's velvet growl, "the little chemist, tell me, Ilara, what exactly is the chemical composition of a gold digger's ambition? I've always wanted to know the exact formula." "Helena, that's enough," Julian warned, but there was no heat in it. He was testing Ilara. He wanted to see if his match could survive his family. Ilara didn't flinch. She took her seat, looked Helena straight in the eye, and smiled. A slow, dangerous smile that she'd learned from surviving the streets before she ever got to the university. "I wouldn't know, Helena," Ilara replied calmly. "But I can tell you the formula for insecurity. It usually involves a lot of vintage wine and a desperate need to belittle anyone who didn't inherit their personality from a trust fund." The room went silent. Julian's glass stopped halfway to his mouth. Helena's eyes flared with a sudden, sharp interest. "She has teeth," Helena murmured, looking at Julian. "I'll give you that. but teeth won't help her when the board finds out about her father's previous associations. Julian froze. What associations? Helena smirked, pulling a file from her silk clutch. Oh, didn't the architect tell you? Our lovely Alara's father wasn't just a failed businessman. Before his accident, he was the lead auditor for Thorne International, our biggest rival, and he disappeared right as $10 billion went missing from their accounts. Alara's heart stopped. She looked at the file, then at Julian, whose face had turned into a mask of pure, unadulterated cold. "Is this true?" Julian asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Did you know your father was connected to the Thorns?" Alara opened her mouth to speak, to tell him she knew nothing, but the image of the black envelope in her bag flashed in her mind. The voice in the dark, the man she'd seen at the gala. It was all clicking into place, a trap far larger than a marriage contract. But before she could answer, the penthouse's secure elevator chimed. The doors slid open to reveal a man Julian clearly wasn't expecting. It was Dr. Aris Thorne, and he wasn't wearing his lab coat. He was wearing a suit that cost more than Julian, and he wasn't looking at Alara like a mentor anymore. He was looking at her like a piece of property he'd finally come to claim. "I believe you have something of mine, Julian," Aris said, stepping into the room. The war for the Vane Empire was no longer just about a marriage clause. It was a collision of secrets, and Alara Vance was right in the center of the blast zone. As the three most powerful people in the room converged, Alara realized that the match wasn't just a lucky break, it was a setup. And the person who had set it up was the only one who wasn't in the room. What Julian didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Alara's father wasn't just an auditor. He had left her one final experiment in a locked safety deposit box. An experiment that didn't just hold the key to the missing billions, but the key to destroying every single person in this room. As Julian stepped toward Aris, his hand reaching for Alara's arm in a gesture of ownership, she realized she had to make a choice. Stay the pawn or become the player. The silence was broken by the sound of Alara's phone. A single notification appeared on the screen, visible only to her. "Are you ready to see how it really turns out?" The silence in the penthouse was no longer quiet. It was a scream. Julian didn't just stand. He loomed, a storm cloud wrapped in a $5,000 suit, his eyes fixed on the man who had just strolled into his sanctuary like he owned the floor plan. Aris Thorne, the man Alara had looked up to as a mentor, the man who had guided her through the complexities of organic chemistry, wasn't looking at a chalkboard anymore. He was looking at Julian with the kind of predatory calm that only comes from old, inherited malice. "You're out of your jurisdiction, Thorne," Julian said, his voice a low, vibrating growl that seemed to rattle the crystal glassware on the table. "This is a private residence, not a faculty lounge. Get out before I have Marcus show you the express route to the lobby." Aris didn't move. He didn't even blink. He adjusted the cuff of his jacket, a fabric so fine it made Julian's look like burlap, and smiled. It wasn't the warm, encouraging smile of a professor. It was the sharp, surgical grin of a man who knew exactly where the nerves were most sensitive. "The jurisdiction of the Thorne family extends wherever our interests lie, Julian," Aris replied, his voice smooth as silk and just as cold. "And Alara, she is very much a Thorne interest. Long before she became your little contractual curiosity, she was part of a legacy your grandfather tried to bury. I didn't go undercover at the university to teach undergraduates the Krebs cycle. I went there to find what belongs to me." Alara felt the room spinning. She looked from Julian, the man who had bought her future, to Aris, the man who had been ghosting her past. She felt like a specimen under a microscope, watched by two scientists who were more interested in the results than the living thing on the slide. "I don't belong to anyone," Alara said, her voice cutting through their posturing like a blade. She stood up, her chair screeching against the marble floor. "I am not a Thorne interest, and I am not a vain project. You both talk about me like I'm a line item in a ledger. What? Helena, watching from the wings like a spectator at a high-stakes gladiator match, let out a sharp, jagged laugh. Oh, Julian, you really did pick a live one. But Eris is right about one thing. The board is already asking questions. If the Thorn heir is claiming a prior stake in our CEO's fiancé, the stocks won't just dip. They'll crater. Julian ignored his sister. He stepped toward Elara, his hand reaching out, not with the coldness of the contract, but with a sudden, desperate flash of something that looked remarkably like protection. Elara, stay behind me. I don't know what he told you at the lab, but the Thorns are vultures. They don't want you. They want the audit files your father hid. And what do you want, Julian? Elara stepped back, avoiding his touch. The inheritance, the shares, to win a game against a rival. You're both the same. You just use different currencies. She didn't wait for an answer. She grabbed her bag, the one containing the black envelope and the Polaroid of her father, and headed for the elevator. Elara, wait. Julian's voice echoed through the penthouse, but she didn't stop. The doors slid shut, cutting off the sight of the two most powerful men in the city standing in the ruins of their own arrogance. The cool night air of the city hit her like a physical shock. She didn't call Marcus. She didn't want a vain driver or a Thorn escort. She walked toward the bus stop, her midnight blue silk gown dragging against the pavement, a surreal sight for the late-night commuters. Her mind was racing. If Eris was a Thorn and her father had been an auditor for the Thorns, then the accident that had put her father in the hospital wasn't an accident at all. It was a hit. She reached the hospital just as the visiting hours were officially ending. The nurses, used to seeing her at odd hours, let her slip past. Her father looked smaller than usual in the harsh, fluorescent glow of the room. He was a man of secrets, a man who had tried to protect her by staying silent, but that silence was now the most dangerous thing in her life. She sat by his bed, her hands shaking as she pulled out the black envelope. She looked at the Polaroid again. There was something in the background, a detail she'd missed in her initial panic. On the bedside table in the photo, there was a book, a specific, worn-out textbook on biochemistry that she had given him months ago. She reached for the physical book on the real nightstand. It was still there. She flipped through the pages, her heart hammering. On page 394, right next to a diagram of a molecular bond, there was a small, indented mark in the paper. It wasn't a note. It was a set of coordinates and a 6-digit code. The safety deposit box. But as she looked up, she saw a reflection in the window of the hospital room. A shadow moved in the hallway. Someone had followed her, not Julian and not Eris. This shadow was leaner, faster, and lacked the polished grace of a billionaire. Elara didn't scream. She didn't have time. She shoved the book into her bag and ducked into the bathroom just as the door to the room creaked open. Through the gap in the door, she saw a man in a dark hoodie approach her father's bed. He wasn't there to check a pulse. He was reaching for the oxygen line. Her survival instinct, honed by years of being the girl who had to fight for every scholarship and every meal, kicked in. She grabbed a heavy glass vase from the bathroom counter, stepped out, and swung with everything she had. The glass shattered against the man's shoulder, sending him staggering back. He cursed, a rough, guttural sound, and lunged for her. Elara scrambled past him, screaming for the nurses, her voice echoing through the sterile halls. The man, realizing the hit was blown, didn't stick around. He bolted for the fire exit, disappearing into the labyrinth of the hospital. Minutes later, the room was swarming with security. And then, like an inevitable force of nature, Julian Vane appeared. He was breathless, his tie pulled loose, his eyes wild with a fear that didn't belong to a man who only cared about contracts. "Elara, are you hurt?" He grabbed her shoulders, his hands trembling. "They tried to kill him, Julian," she whispered, the adrenaline finally fatting and leaving her hollow. "They're not waiting for the marriage. They're not waiting for the board. They want it now." Julian pulled her into his chest, and for the first time, she didn't pull away. The scent of his sandalwood cologne was the only thing grounding her in a world that had gone completely insane. "I'm moving you both," Julian said, his voice hard as flint. "To the Vane compound. It's a fortress. No one gets in, not Eris, not the Thorns, and certainly not some low-level hitman." "I'm not a guest, Julian," Alara said, pulling back just enough to look him in the eye. "I'm the only person who knows how to find what everyone is looking for. If I go with you, we aren't just partners in a marriage. We're partners in a war. And when this is over, the contract is dead. I want my life back." Julian looked at her, the brilliance, the fire, the woman who had just taken down an assassin with a flower vase, and he realized the algorithm hadn't just found him a match. It had found him his undoing. "Whatever you want, Alara," he whispered. "Just stay alive to collect it." As they walked out of the hospital, shielded by a dozen Vane security guards, Alara caught sight of a black car idling across the street. The window rolled down just an inch. A pair of eyes watched them, eyes that didn't belong to Eris or Julian. The game was no longer two-sided. There was a third player in the shadows, someone who had been watching the Vanes and the Thorns for decades, waiting for the perfect match to ignite the fuse. And as the car sped away, Alara realized that the safety deposit box didn't just contain money. It contained the one thing that could make a billionaire beg for mercy. The journey to the Vane compound was just the beginning of a long, cold night. But as the gates locked behind them, Alara knew one thing for certain. Julian Vane thought he was protecting his inheritance, but he was actually walking into a trap she was about to set. The Vane compound was less of a home and more of a sovereign state, a sprawling fortress of glass and limestone tucked behind 3 layers of biometric security and a small army of men in tactical gear. As the heavy iron gates hissed shut behind them, Alara felt the weight of the city, and the shadow of the man in the hospital lift, only to be replaced by a different kind of pressure. Here, inside the Citadel, Julian Vane wasn't just a CEO, he was a king. And she was the queen who had been bought to secure his crown. "You'll stay in the East Wing," Julian said, his voice echoing through the vaulted marble foyer. He didn't look at her as he stripped off his jacket, revealing the holster strapped to his side, a jarring reminder that his world wasn't just made of spreadsheets and gala invitations. "It's the most secure. My father's old medical suite is being prepped for your father. He'll have round-the-clock nursing and a direct line to the best neurologists in the country. No one gets in without my thumbprint." "Not even Eris Thorn?" Alara asked, her voice tight. Julian stopped, his back to her. He turned slowly, his eyes dark with a possessive heat he couldn't quite mask. "Eris Thorn doesn't exist within these walls. He's a ghost, Alara, and ghosts can't touch what belongs to me." "I don't belong to you, Julian," she reminded him, though the conviction in her voice was wavering. "We're business partners, remember." "Business partners don't take bullets for each other," Julian countered, stepping into her personal space. He reached out, his thumb grazing the line of her jaw where a smudge of hospital dust still lingered. "And they certainly don't look at each other the way you looked at me when that light went out in the ballroom. You were terrified, but you reached for me. Why?" Before she could answer, before she could admit that in a world of monsters, he was the only one whose scent made her feel like she could breathe. A sharp, melodic chime echoed through the hall. A young woman, barely 20, slid down the grand staircase's banister with a grace that suggested she'd done it 1,000 times. She was dressed in oversized techwear, a pair of augmented reality glasses perched on her head like a crown. This was Sloane Vane, Julian's youngest sister and the family's resident genius hacker. "Julian, the board is having a literal aneurysm," Sloane said, not even glancing at Alara as she tapped away at a holographic projection on her wrist. "The Thorn International acquisition just went hostile. Eris is moving on our supply chain in Lagos. And who is the new girl? She's significantly more symmetrical than the last one." "Sloane, meet Alara. Alara, this is the reason our security system is terrifying." Julian sighed. though there was a hint of genuine affection in his tone. Sloane finally looked up, her eyes scanning Alara with the same clinical precision Julian used. Biochem major, top of her class. Father is a disgraced auditor. You're the match. Statistically, you're the most interesting thing to happen to this house in a decade. Also, I've already scrubbed your digital footprint. You're welcome. I didn't ask you to do that, Alara said, bristling. You didn't have to, Sloane shrugged. In this family, privacy is a luxury we traded for power a long time ago. Speaking of power, grandmother wants to see you, both of you, in the library, now. Julian's jaw tightened. If Helena was the enforcer, Lydia Vane was the architect of the entire Vane dynasty. She was the one who had written the marriage clause, the one who pulled the strings of the board from her velvet-lined study. The library was a cavernous room that smelled of old parchment and expensive tobacco. Lydia sat in a high-backed wing chair, her white hair perfectly coiffed, her eyes as sharp as the diamonds on her fingers. She didn't offer them a seat. You've caused quite a stir, Julian, Lydia began, her voice a fragile rasp that held the authority of a whip. The Thorn boy is at our gates, and our future CEO is playing bodyguard to a girl whose father might have stolen $10 billion from our rivals. Tell me, why shouldn't I exercise the morality clause and strip you of your title tonight? Because she has the coordinates, grandmother, Julian said, his voice steady. Alara felt a jolt of betrayal. He'd known. He'd seen her looking at that textbook. What coordinates? Lydia leaned forward, her interest piqued. The audit trails, Julian continued, his eyes locked on his grandmother. The ones that prove Thorn International didn't just lose $10 billion, they laundered it. And Alara's father was the only one who figured out the algorithm they used. She's not just my match for the inheritance, she's the key to the Thorn's destruction. Lydia turned her piercing gaze to Alara. Is this true, child? Do you have what my grandson says? Alara looked at Julian. He was using her. Again. He'd brought her here for safety, yes, but he was also using her as a shield against his own family's coup. But as she saw the flicker of desperation in his eyes, she realized he was also trying to give Lydia a reason not to discard her. I have the code, Alara said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming as cold as the marble they stood on. But I'm the only one who can translate it, and I won't do it for the Vanes. I'll do it for my father. If you want those coordinates, you ensure his safety, and you give me a seat at the table when the Thorn Empire falls. Lydia let out a dry, rattling laugh. Julian, you were right. She is a match. Most girls would be asking for a bigger diamond. This one wants a seat at the table. She's earned it, Julian muttered. Very well, Lydia waved a hand. Prove your worth, Alara Vance. But remember, in this house, if you aren't at the table, you're on the menu. Julian, take her to the safe room. Start the translation. We move against the Thorns at dawn. As they left the library, the tension between them was electric. Julian led her down a hidden corridor, his hand firm on her arm. He didn't stop until they were inside his private study, the door locking with a heavy thud. You knew, Alara hissed, turning on him. You saw me find the code in the hospital. I saw you find something, Julian admitted, his face inches from hers. And I knew that if I didn't give Lydia a reason to keep you, she would have had you removed from the compound by morning. I was protecting you, Alara. By making me a target for your grandmother, too. Julian didn't answer with words. He grabbed the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her hair, and kissed her, a hard, desperate collision that tasted of adrenaline and things they weren't allowed to say. It wasn't the fake kiss of the gala. It was a claim. Alara pulled back, breathless, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm. The contract said no feelings, Julian. The contract is a piece of paper, he whispered, his forehead resting against hers. This is a war, and I'm not losing my best soldier. He stepped away, opening a drawer and pulling out a high-resolution scanner. Give me the book, Alara. Let's see what your father was really hiding. She pulled the worn biochemistry textbook from her bag, her fingers tracing the mark on page 394. But as Julian scanned the page, the screen didn't show coordinates. It showed a DNA sequence, a specific, modified strand that looked nothing like a standard human genome. Sloane's voice crackled over the intercom, sounding more serious than Alara had ever heard her. "Julian, I just intercepted a transmission from the Thorn compound. They aren't looking for money. They're looking for Project Chimera. And Julian, the biological marker they're tracking, it's not in the book." Alara felt the blood drain from her face as the scanner finished its analysis of the book, then automatically scanned the nearest biological heat signature. The screen turned bright red, a warning flashing in bold letters. "The marker isn't in the book, Sloane," Julian said, his eyes wide as he looked at the screen, then at Alara. "The marker is in her." The realization hit like a physical blow. The match wasn't an algorithm for a wife. It was a search for a host, and as the alarms in the compound began to blare, signaling a breach at the outer perimeter, Alara realized that the most dangerous secret wasn't in a safety deposit box. It was running through her veins. "Julian," she whispered, as the lights in the study began to flicker, "if I'm the project, then who was the architect?" Before he could answer, the floor beneath them shuddered as an explosion rocked the east wing. The Thorns hadn't waited for dawn. They were here for their property. But as Julian reached for his weapon, Alara saw a flicker of movement in the shadows of the study, someone who had been inside the Citadel the whole time. A side of the Vane family she hadn't met yet, and one that was holding a silenced pistol aimed directly at Julian's heart. The click of a safety being disengaged was louder than the sirens wailing across the estate. Julian didn't flinch, but his entire body went rigid, a human shield forming between Alara and the shadow standing by the mahogany bookshelf. It wasn't a Thorn hitman. It was Silas Vane, Julian's cousin and the man in charge of the family's West African logistics. Silas, the reliable one. The one who had sat through every boring board meeting with a smile that Alara now realized was a mask for a deep, simmering rot. "Step away from her, Julian," Silas said, his voice devoid of its usual stutter. "The Thorns aren't here to kill you. Not yet. They're just here to collect the asset. You were never supposed to fall for the match. You were supposed to secure her, marry her, and hand over the keys to the lab once the inheritance was settled." The asset, Julian's voice was a low, dangerous vibration. "She's a human being, Silas. She's a student. She's my wife-to-be." "She's a patent with a heartbeat," Silas countered, his eyes flickering to the screen where the DNA sequence was still pulsing a rhythmic neon red. "Project Chimera wasn't just an audit. It was an evolution. Your father didn't just find the missing billions, Alara. He spent them. He spent them on you. Every vaccine you were given as a child, every vitamin your father insisted you take. It was a delivery system for a synthetic protein that can rewrite a human's immune response. You are the cure for every biological weapon the Thorns ever developed, and you're the weapon that can bankrupt them." Alara felt a coldness spread through her limbs that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Her entire life, the scholarships, the late nights in the lab, even her interest in biochemistry, it felt like it had been programmed into her. She wasn't just a match for Julian, she was a match for a global catastrophe. "The architect didn't find me," Alara whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "The architect created me. And now we're going to see how much you're worth on the open market," Silas said, stepping forward. Suddenly, the monitors in the room flickered. Sloane's voice cut through the tension, distorted by static but filled with a savage glee. "Hey, Silas, you forgot one thing. I built this study's security, and I don't like people who point guns at my brother." The floorboards beneath Silas hissed. A high-pressure burst of halon gas erupted from the vents, designed to suppress fires but equally effective at blinding a traitor. Silas gasped, his shot going wide and shattering a priceless Ming vase behind Julian's head. Julian didn't hesitate. He lunged through the fog, a blur of charcoal wool and calculated violence. He disarmed Silas with a sickening crack of a wrist bone and a punch that sent his cousin into the darkness of unconsciousness. "Marcus, get to the study," Julian barked into his comms, grabbing Alara's hand. "We have to go," Julian said, his eyes scanning her for injuries. "The perimeter is gone. Aris isn't playing by the rules of engagement anymore. He sent in a retrieval team." They sprinted through the corridors of the Vane Citadel, the smell of ozone and smoke filling the air. The east wing was a skeleton of fire and twisted metal. As they reached the sub-level garage, the heavy blast doors began to groan under the weight of an external breach. "Wait," Alara stopped, pulling back. "My father, Julian, we can't leave him." "Sloane already moved him to the underground med bay," Julian said, dragging her toward a matte black armored SUV. "Marcus is with him. They're taking the tunnel to the harbor. We're the decoys, Alara. If they think we're still in the compound, they'll focus their fire here." As the SUV roared to life, the garage doors finally buckled. 3 tactical vehicles, unmarked and lethal, roared in. Aris Thorne stood on the lead vehicle, his academic spectacles replaced by a high-tech visor. He didn't look like a professor anymore. He looked like a general. "Drive," Julian commanded. The SUV smashed through the barricade, the bulletproof glass spiderwebbing under a hail of gunfire. Alara ducked low, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at Julian, who was calmly steering the heavy vehicle through a maze of fire and debris, his jaw set in a grim line. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked over the roar of the engine. "About the DNA, about the project." "I didn't know the extent of it until tonight," Julian admitted, swerving to avoid an exploding fuel tank. "I thought the match was about intellectual compatibility. I thought for once my grandfather had actually found me someone who could look me in the eye and not be afraid. I didn't know you were the prize in a war I didn't start." "And now?" Julian looked at her, and for the first time the billionaire heir looked human. "Now the contract is officially null and void. You're not my fiancée. You're the most hunted woman on the planet, and I'm the only one crazy enough to keep you." They tore out of the compound gates, heading for the heart of the city. But as they merged onto the highway, Alara's phone, the one Sloane had supposedly scrubbed, began to vibrate. It wasn't a text. It was a live video feed. It showed the underground med bay. It showed Marcus on the floor, unconscious, and it showed her father's bed empty. A voice came over the car's speakers, bypassing Julian's encryption. It wasn't Aris Thorne. It was a voice Alara recognized from her childhood, a voice she thought was dead. "The Chimera always returns to its creator, Alara," the voice whispered. "Julian was just the delivery boy. Now come home, or the University of Lagos becomes the epicenter of the first trial run." Julian slammed on the brakes, the tires screaming as the car skidded to a halt in the middle of the empty bridge. He looked at the screen, then at Alara, his face pale. "That was your father's partner," Julian whispered. "The man who supposedly died in the audit fire." Alara looked out at the city skyline, the lights of Lagos flickering like a dying circuit. The billionaire heir had found his match, but the match had just ignited a fuse that would burn down everything they both knew. The student was no longer just a senior in college. She was the cure, the weapon, and the only thing standing between the veins, the thorns, and a man who wanted to watch the world bleed. "Turn the car around, Julian," Alara said, her voice devoid of fear, replaced by a cold, scientific clarity. "We aren't running anymore. If he wants a trial run, let's give him one he won't survive." The screech of the tires against the concrete of the third mainland bridge was a violent, mourning sound, echoing over the black waters of the lagoon. Julian didn't argue. He didn't lecture her on tactical safety or the insanity of driving back into a kill zone. He simply spun the steering wheel with a white-knuckled intensity that spoke of a man who had finally realized he wasn't the one in the driver's seat of this relationship. "If we do this," Julian said, his voice dropping into that dangerously calm register he used right before a hostile takeover, "we do it my way. We don't just walk into the University of Lagos. We burn the thorns path to the ground before we even step out of this car." "Julian, you don't understand," Alara said, her eyes fixed on the live feed of the empty medbay on her phone. "Elias Voss. He was my father's shadow. If he's alive, it means the audit fire wasn't a cover-up for the money. It was a cover-up for his first failed attempt at the Chimera sequence. He doesn't want the university because of the labs. He wants it because of the central ventilation system in the science block. If he releases a trial strain there, thousands of students, my friends, Chloe, they're all test subjects." The SUV surged forward, weaving through the late-night traffic of Lagos like a predatory shark. Julian was already on his comms, his voice barking orders to the remnants of his security detail. "Sloan, I need a total blackout of the Yaba district. Kill the streetlights, the cell towers, everything except the private vein frequency. And get me Professor Adami on a secure line. He's the only one who still has the manual overrides for the science block's basement." "Adami?" Alara looked at him, surprised. "The old dean of science. He's been retired for years." "He was on the Vane payroll long before you were born, Alara," Julian said, a grim smirk touching his lips. "My grandfather didn't just invest in tech, he invested in people. Everyone has a price, and Adami was the funding for his research into regenerative medicine. He knows the tunnels under the university better than the architect who drew them." As they approached the gates of the University of Lagos, the world went dark. Sloan had done her job. The sprawling campus was plunged into an eerie, suffocating silence, the only light coming from the moon reflecting off the lagoon. Julian killed the SUV's headlights, gliding the armored beast to a halt behind a row of ancient frangipani trees. A figure emerged from the shadows near the back entrance of the library. It was a small, wiry man in a faded safari jacket, Professor Adami. He looked terrified, but his hands were steady as he held up a heavy ring of iron keys. "Julian," the professor whispered as they approached, "you've brought the storm to my doorstep. The men inside, they aren't scientists. They have equipment I've only seen in military journals. They've barricaded the science block and they're hauling pressurized tanks into the vents." "Where is my father?" Ilara grabbed the professor's arm, her voice a desperate plea. "They took a man in a wheelchair to the sub-basement," Adami said, his eyes filled with pity. "They called it the extraction point. Ilara, child, you shouldn't be here. You are the only thing they need to complete the sequence." "Which is exactly why I'm the only one who can stop them," she replied, her fear hardening into something cold and crystalline. She looked at Julian. "I need to get to the main lab. I can synthesize a neutralizer, but I need 10 minutes of total silence. No interruptions, no gunfire." Julian checked his weapon, his eyes meeting hers in the dark. For a moment, the billionaire heir and the college student disappeared, replaced by two souls bound by a secret that could end the world. He reached out, his hand cupping the back of her head, pulling her forehead against his. "I'll give you 20, Julian whispered. "I'm going to make so much noise in the sub-basement that Voss won't even remember your name. But Alara, if you see Aris Thorne, don't hesitate. He's not a teacher anymore. He's a competitor." They split up at the entrance to the maintenance tunnels. Julian and Marcus, who had somehow managed to crawl out of the medbay and meet them at the perimeter, bloodied but unbowed, headed for the sub-basement. Ilara, guided by Professor Adami, climbed the narrow, dust-choked stairs toward the third-floor labs. The science block felt like a tomb. The familiar smell of formaldehyde and floor wax was overridden by a sharp, metallic scent, the smell of ozone and specialized chemicals. As Ilara slipped into her familiar lab, she saw the tanks Voss's men had installed. They were connected to the main HVAC system, glowing with a faint, sickly green luminescence. She moved with a frantic, practiced grace, grabbing reagents from the locked cabinets. She didn't need a manual. The formulas were burned into her brain. Part of the programming, she was finally starting to understand. She was mixing her own blood with a base of silver nitrate when the door to the lab creaked open. She didn't look up. "You're late, Aris. I expected you to be waiting in the chair." "I was never the one in the chair, Alara," Aris Thorne said, stepping into the dim light. He wasn't wearing his visor now. He looked exhausted, his expensive suit torn, a smear of blood across his cheek. But he wasn't holding a gun. He was holding a small, encrypted drive. "Julian thinks I want to kill you," Aris said, his voice hollow. "My family. They want the project. They want to own the cure so they can sell the disease. But I've spent 3 years watching you in this lab. I've watched you struggle, watched you fight for your father. I didn't go undercover to find the project, Alara. I went to see if the chimera could actually be human." "And?" Alara asked, her hand hovering over a beaker of fuming acid. "And I realized that Julian Vane is the luckiest man on Earth, and he doesn't even know why," Aris said, tossing the drive onto the lab bench. "That's the override for the tanks. It'll neutralize the strain before it hits the vents, but you have to leave now. Voss is in the sub-basement with your father. He's not waiting for a trial run. He's waiting for Julian to get close enough to trigger the building's demolition." Alara's heart stopped. "It's a suicide trap." "Julian knows," Aris whispered. "He's known since we hit the gates. He's down there right now, distracting them so you can finish the cure. He's sacrificing the Vane heir to save the match." Alara didn't think. She grabbed the neutralizer, the drive, and a scalpel from the tray. She didn't head for the exit. She headed for the service elevator that led straight to the sub-basement. "Alara, stop," Aris shouted behind her. "You'll die." "Then at least the project dies with me," she yelled back as the elevator doors hissed shut. The descent felt like an eternity. When the doors opened, the sound of gunfire was deafening. The sub-basement was a war zone of concrete and flickering emergency lights. She saw Julian pinned behind a heavy industrial boiler, his shoulder bleeding, his eyes fixed on a glass-walled chamber at the far end of the room. Inside the chamber, her father sat in his wheelchair, unconscious. And standing over him, his hand on a red lever, was Dr. Elias Voss. Voss looked exactly as he had in her nightmares, a man with eyes like flat, gray stones and a smile that held no warmth. He looked up as Alara stepped out of the elevator, his smile widening. "The perfect timing," Voss's voice boomed over the intercom. "Julian, look. Your match has arrived to witness the birth of a new era, or perhaps the end of your bloodline." Julian looked at Alara, his face contorted in a mask of agony and rage. "Get out of here. Alara, go." But Alara wasn't looking at Julian. She was looking at the control panel next to the elevator. She saw the wires, the connections, the sequence. She realized that the demolition wasn't triggered by a timer. It was triggered by Julian's heartbeat, synced to his Vane-issued smartwatch. Voss had turned the hero into the detonator. If Julian's heart stopped, or if it beat too fast from the adrenaline of the fight, the building would level the entire university. Alara looked at the neutralizer in her hand. She looked at Julian. And then she did the one thing the algorithm never could have predicted. She didn't run to the lab. She didn't run to her father. She ran straight into the line of fire, toward Julian, her eyes locked on his. "Julian," she screamed over the chaos. "Trust me, I need you to stop breathing." As the billionaire heir stared at her in shock, Alara realized that to save the match, she had to break the man. And to save the city, she had to play a game of biological chess where the only winning move was to lose everything. Alara didn't wait for Julian to understand. She tackled him behind the heavy iron boiler, the smell of gunpowder and his expensive sandalwood cologne mixing with the sharp, metallic scent of the chemicals in her hand. The world was a blur of flashing red emergency lights, and the rhythmic thud of Voss's men trying to breach the sub-basement doors. "The watch, Julian, your heart is the detonator," she screamed over the roar of a nearby steam pipe. "If your pulse spikes, we all die. I need to override the biometric lock now." Julian looked at her, his eyes wide and dark with a mixture of terror and a sudden, blinding trust. He didn't pull away. He didn't try to take command. For the first time in his life, the king of vain tech surrendered his power to someone else. He shoved his wrist toward her, his skin hot against her cold, shaking fingers. Alara slammed Eris's encrypted drive into the side of the watch. Her fingers flew across the interface, her biochemistry background allowing her to see the patterns in the code that a standard hacker would miss. The Vane family encryption wasn't just math, it was a biological sequence, a digital mirror of the Chimera project. "Look at me," she whispered, her voice a low anchor in the chaos. She grabbed his face with her free hand, forcing him to lock eyes with her. "Ignore the guns, ignore the fire, just breathe with me. Slow, in for 4, out for 4. As she worked, Elias Voss stepped out from the glass chamber, his hand hovering over the manual backup lever. He looked like a man who had already won, his gray eyes shining with a fanatical light. "You can't code your way out of destiny, Alara. The Chimera was built to survive. The Vanes were built to hoard. Both are obsolete. If I can't have the cure, no one will." "You're wrong, Voss," Alara shouted, her eyes never leaving the glowing screen on Julian's wrist. "You didn't build a project. You built a daughter, and daughters eventually grow up to bury their fathers." Click. The green light on Julian's watch turned a steady, calm blue. The heart rate monitor on the detonator's receiver flatlined, tricking the system into thinking Julian Vane was already dead. The bomb's countdown froze at 3 seconds. In the sudden, heavy silence that followed, Julian didn't hesitate. He surged forward with the grace of a predator that had finally been unchained. He didn't use a gun. He didn't use a contract. He used the raw, suppressed rage of a man who had been treated as a pawn his entire life. He crashed into Elias Voss, sending them both spiraling into the very gas tanks Voss had sought to weaponize. A single, bone-crushing blow sent the doctor into the darkness of unconsciousness. Alara scrambled to the glass chamber, smashing the lock with a fire extinguisher. She dragged her father out, his breathing thin and ragged but stable. Julian was there a second later, his arm around her, his blood staining the midnight blue silk of her dress. "We have to go," Julian rasped, his eyes scanning the ceiling as the first tremors of the building's structural failure began to shake the floor. "The neutralizer is working, but the Thorns retrieval team won't stay down for long." They didn't stay to see the aftermath. Guided by the shadows and the remnants of Julian's loyal security detail, they emerged from the tunnels of the University of Lagos and into the cool, salt-tinged air of the night. The campus was a sea of blue and red lights, the sirens a distant hum compared to the roar of the adrenaline still singing in Alara's veins. They stood on the edge of the lagoon, the skyline of the city flickering like a dying circuit. Julian turned to her, his face illuminated by the moonlight. He looked at the ring on her finger, the heavy, diamond shackle that had started this entire nightmare as a cold business arrangement. "The contract is over, Alara," he said, his voice raw with an emotion that the architect could never have calculated. "The debt is paid. Voss is in custody and my grandmother is already scrubbing the board. You're free. I'll have the papers drawn up by morning. You can go back to your life. You can be the doctor you always wanted to be." Alara looked at the ring, then at the man who had been willing to let his heart stop to keep her safe. She realized that the match wasn't about DNA, and it wasn't about the billions of dollars currently sitting in the Vane vaults. It was about finding the one person who could see through the armor. She didn't take the ring off. She reached up, her fingers tracing the jagged line of a cut on his cheek. "I told you, Julian, I'm not Cinderella. I don't need a prince to save me. I need a partner who can keep up." Julian's lips curved into the first genuine, unscripted smile she had ever seen. Then, I guess we have 22 more chapters to figure out what that looks like. The billionaire heir had finally found his match, but the world didn't turn out the way anyone expected. The student wasn't a victim, the billionaire wasn't a hero. And the perfect match turned out to be the most dangerous alliance the elite had ever seen. They were no longer playing a game of contracts, they were building an empire of their own. But the real question remains. In a world where your very DNA has been programmed for someone else's profit, can you ever truly know if your feelings are your own, or just another part of the experiment? If you were Alara, would you keep the ring and the man, knowing he was the one who bought your life in the first place? Let us know in the comments. Your theories might just change the course of Chapter 9. Don't forget to like this video if you loved this explosive finale. Share it with your friends who love a high-stakes romance. And subscribe with notifications turned on so you don't miss the next part of this 30-chapter saga. The mystery of the Vane legacy is only just beginning, and you won't believe how it turns out next.